Things change slowly and
Now
Let's start a recording.
You're recording. Okay, thank you. All right, so good morning and welcome to another year of Friday Shir. Thank you for those who are here in person as well as those who are on the Zoom. The way that we're managing Shemitah this year for our topic is that Rabbi Bergman is giving the Thursday Chabura, although others may join in to give that as well, and that's going to be more on the Yerushalmi that the guys are learning in internal Seder. And then the Friday Shir is still going to tie in to the program that we're learning in Yerushalmi, but it'll be more topical. And for Elul, it's going to be really about topics that are sort of bigger picture, that aren't necessarily addressed in the Yerushalmi, but that are important to know in order to get anywhere in Shemitah. Questions like, is Shemitah d'oraisa or d'Rabbanan in our day? How do you calculate the year of Shemitah? When exactly is Shemitah in effect? Where is Shemitah in effect? What's considered part of eretz Yisrael? Those are the sort of the big topics that we have to address just to get anywhere, that are not really Yerushalmi based. I want to make sure to introduce, for those who have not yet seen him, Rabbi Chaim Metzger, who, depending on the layout of the tiles on your screen, is in various places, but the name at least is Chaim Metzger, and he's live and he doesn't have a picture of Rabbi Kanofsky as his picture, so you can actually see him. But welcome Rabbi Metzger, who is currently in the U.S. on his way, God willing, during the week next week. So looking forward to that. So just for those who are interested in the Thursday Chabura, that goes on at 11:30 a.m. and there's a Zoom option. There's also an in-person option here at Clanton Park. Okay. Framing the learning that we're doing. So I actually was going to put something on the source sheet, and now I see I didn't, but I did email it out to the Shir email list, which is a link to a Google Drive that I shared, which has useful Sfarim as well as a topical index of Mishnayot Shvius and the Rambam's Hilchos Shmitah v'Yoloville that may be useful to you. I thought I had put it on the source sheet. I did not put it on the source sheet, but again, it should be in your email. If you're not on the Shir email list, let me know and I'll be glad to add you. What we're going to do this morning is an overview of Shemitah's Karka, Shemitah of land. Even though in the email that I sent out with the Mar Makomos, I included sources related to Shemitah's Ksafim, I'm hoping to get to Shemitah of Ksafim, the nullification of loans, like in Kayetzman. But the bulk of the year will be on Shemitah of land. And what I really want to do here is identify the field of play. What are the major issues? What are the key problems we need to address in order to understand Shemitah and how it works? So if you take a look at the beginning of the sheet, you'll see I gave you a basic outline. Everyone who's on the Zoom have the sources that I sent out? There's no need then for me to do the sharing of the screen at all, right? If not, speak up now. Mickey, you're muted, so I'm just assuming that you've got it, and you'll tell me if you're not. Okay. So this outline is what we're going to follow in general in the course of the Shir, to look at the question of when is Shemitah, the Isurim, the prohibitions involved in working the land, of the requirement of abandoning the produce that grows in the land, the mitzvah of harvesting in an unusual way, and we'll talk about that obviously and explain that. And then finally, Kedusha Shvi is the sanctity of Shemitah produce. Those are the major areas. You could possibly come up with a different outline, and you are free to do so. This is what I have found helpful to me, and hopefully will be helpful to you. God willing, everything about Shemitah will fit into some piece of this outline. But I wanted to actually start first with a little bit of Agadata, a little bit about the value of Shemitah and benefits of Shemitah. I gave a longer shir on this, which is on YU Torah, as a Parsha shir last year for Bahar. And you could find it on there. But Shemitah is obviously not just a mitzvah, but a critical mitzvah in the Torah, something that is given outsized importance. And I say obviously because if you look at the Tochacha and Parshas Bechukosai, you see just how critical it is. If you take a look at source Aleph, it says Hashem warns, he is going to scatter us among the nations. He's going to send the sword after us. The land will be desolate, and the land will then finally get satisfaction for Shabsoseha, all of its Shabbatot, the Shemitah years. Kol Yemei Hashama, all those years when it will be in ruins, and you will be out of the land. Az Tishbas Haaretz V'Irtzasa Shabsoseha. At that point, the land will be desolate. It will cease having to work, and it will get its Shemitah back. Kol Yemei Hashama Tishbos Es Asher Lo It's going to get that break for all the years of Shemitah that you did not observe. And the message here, I think, is not simply it's a coincidence. Hey, look, the land will be desolate. You'll be out. By the way, the land will make up Shemitah. It's a connection of your lack of observance of Shemitah led to this point. So that there is a national catastrophe that is associated with failure to observe Shemitah, and there's also a personal catastrophe associated with it, which the Gemara outlines in
Rabbi Torczyner, you're not connected.
Rabbi Torczyner is getting on with his phone.
Good.
Okay, and we're back. Sorry about that, guys. The computer dropped the connection. But now I'll be on dually here. I'm just muting that and turning off the speaker. Okay. There we go. So now I have two options. So what we were saying was that the Gemara details the damage that takes place in the event that a person in the event that a person violates Shemitah, the damage nationally and the damage personally as well. So why is it that Shemitah is so important? What is it that is so crucial about Shemitah? So one way you can look at Shemitah is to look at sort of the fundamental activities of Shemitah and their benefits. So that you have Shemitah, meaning Shabbaton, abstaining from normal work of the land. That's one activity. A second way to look at it is Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. It is recognizing the holiness of the land of Israel. You're letting the land rest. You're recognizing sanctity in the produce. A third way to look at it is Emunah, your relationship with God. You're not planting, you're not harvesting, you're just expecting everything is going to happen. You're even doing beer, destroying the produce at the end of the year, or making it hefker. And you're engaged in chesed. You're helping other people, right? You make it hefker, you allow others access. That's a sort of a basic run through of 4 dimensions that are involved. The abstaining from work, recognizing holiness of the land, you're building your relationship with Hashem, and you're engaged in chesed for others. But I think also you can actually broaden that by looking at 4 specific benefits of Shemitah in a little bit of a different framework. Midos, improving the world, improving our nation, and building your relationship with Hashem. And this is, I think, a good way to look at it. And I'm going to rush through these 4 different ways. Number 1, it improves our midos. It improves our character. There are lots of ways in which Shemitah improves our character. Rav Shimshon Hirsch, who I brought you in Source Gimel, talks about how it prevents arrogance. That's a major theme for Hirsch in general in Chorev when he talks about various mitzvahs. Rav Shimshon Hirsch loves that. He talks about how Shabbos tells you you're not a creator, you're not someone who's running the world. So too for Shemitah, pride of possession shall not become Israel's downfall. If we're reminded every 7 years, it's not really yours. That's one way it improves our character. The Sefer HaChinuch, which I excerpted in source Daled, says it makes you a person of more chesed, of more generosity. And the Akedas Yitzchak, I told you I was going to bring the Akedas Yitzchak, Sammy, in source Hay, on Parshas Bahar, says it gives us an opportunity to develop ourselves spiritually, teaching us that we are not meant to be enslaved to the soil. So this is all about improving our character. And again, to see more about this, look at the sources that I brought you on the sheet. I'm not reading through them at the expense of the overview of the halachos of Shvius. The second sphere is it benefits the world. And when I say the world, the Rambam believes that means Eretz Yisrael. Specifically, you are improving the quantity and quality of agricultural output. That by leaving the land fallow, the Rambam argues, I'm not sure why I put Rav Kook up there. I didn't mean to. In source Vav, we're going to deal with him, but not right now. But in source Zion, I brought you the Rambam from the Moreh Nevuchim. I don't remember which Hebrew text I used at this point, probably the one from Bar Ilan. But the Rambam says you will actually improve the land in this way by giving it an opportunity to rest. And then you get this really fun idea from Chaim Ibn Attar, the Or HaChaim, writing in Parshas Bereshis on Kivo Shavas Mikol Malachto. He says, and here I want to read this inside, because it's the sort of thing that requires you to read it inside in order to understand what he's saying. He says, if not for Shemitah, the world would cease to exist. He says, the world requires renewal. So take a look at this. He says, Matzinu k'kadosh baruch hu gila hadavar b'mashra amar b'aseres hadibros ki sheishes yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim ve'es haaretz. He says, don't read it as in 6 days Hashem created shamayim and aretz. Rather, read it as for 6 days, for the sake of 6 days, for a 6-day term, Hashem created Shemayim and Aretz. Hare gila ki b'sha'as habriya lo bara Hashem koch ba'olam zulas lamod sheishes yamim latam hanod alo. He says, for reason known only to God, the world has a 6-day term and then it expires. He says, if you're a Yodea Emes, then you know what that means. However, the 7th day is the day when Hashem renews the term of the world for another 6 days. And that's the way it works. And otherwise, the world will be destroyed. And so, too, the world is on a 6-year timer. Comes Shmitah, and it renews the timer. We'll have to talk about how that works when we discuss whether Yovel counts in the 7-year count or does not count, because maybe then Hashem has to add another year to the timer, depending on how Yovel is included, but that's going to be a separate shiur about the calculation of the Shemitah year. But that's how you're benefiting the world. By having Shemitah, it actually gives the world a new lease on life. That's his take. So far, we've raced through 2 different categories. Number 1, Shemitah is critical to improve our midos, our character, so that pride of possession does not become our downfall, so that we are generous, so that we're people of ruchnius, of spirituality, and also it benefits the world, Israel, and the universe as a whole. Third,
Rabbi, I don't see where in the Orach Chaim he talks about the Shemitah year. He talks about the 6 days of creation. Maybe.
Yeah, no, I stopped short of where he does in the excerpt. I stopped short of the Shemitah part. If you keep on reading after my excerpt, then you get to it, and it's also actually developed further in the Shem Shmuel that I brought you in Tess, which I would have skipped if not for your questions. Thank you. The Shem Shmuel is in English there just because it's not on Bar Ilan for me to cut and paste, so I just translated it. And if you want to look into Shem Shmuel, then you can get the original Hebrew. But he expands on this idea of the Orach Chaim, saying that this is true for Shemitah as well. It gives you another 7 years. You can see it there in my translation of the Shem Shmuel and Parshas Bahar.
Since Shemitah is only agricultural, how does that give the world this renewal or this new lease on life? Compared to Shabbos, where we stop everything, this is just an agricultural stop.
So it's much more than agricultural, right? When we look at the impact that it has on our midos, on our chesed, on us as a nation, you realize that it plays a critical role in the function of Hashem's view of how the world is supposed to work and the whole divine plan, right? You got to
join in these other reasons then.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a much bigger picture activity, not to mention we also have Shemitah of loans that we, again, are pushing to the discussion at the end of the year. That's also a piece of this. But as you go through the different ways in which it improves us and our function as a nation, I think you get a bigger picture understanding of why this has such gravity. I want to talk about that building of the nation a minute, because that's really beautiful. There's a story, if you don't have this blue set called Otzar Chaim, it's a very useful set of Sfarim. He has great stories and little pieces on the parsha that are a lot of fun. So he has a story in Parshas Bahar involving the Radomsker Hasidim, and the story in brief goes as follows. The Radomsker Rebbe was somewhere in south central Poland, I believe, in the 19th century. And his Hasidim, there was a period of drought and consequent famine in Radomsk, and there was no wheat. He had some Hasidim who had capital, and they invested in buying up basically all the wheat that was around. They bought all the grain that they could get a hold of. And when they ran out of capital, they also leveraged all their assets to be able to get more money, to be able to buy more grain. And of course, they're doing very well because they're the only holders of grain until word comes that it was either there was rain coming or that there was a shipment of grain coming down the river. I don't remember anymore. I think there was a shipment of grain coming down the river. And of course, the price of grain now drops. And now they're worried because they have invested everything they have in grain, and suddenly the price of the grain is going to drop, and they're going to lose everything they have. So they come to the Rebbe, and they ask the Rebbe to daven for the price of grain to go back up. That's their request. The daven for the price of rain to go back up, and he says to them, "You don't daven for food to become more expensive. That's not cool. You can't do that." And they say, "But we're going to go broke." And his response is the same way that Hashem helped the Aniyim during the time of drought and famine, so now Hashem will help you in the time of plenty. That's his response. But you can't daven for food to become more expensive. And I think you actually see this in the Psukim in Parashas Bahar, because there are two questions that the people ask of Hashem, right? Take a look at source Yud. When you say, what will we eat in the seventh year? We're not going to plant. We're not going to harvest our produce. This isn't one question. This is two questions. Number one, what are we going to eat? We can't plant. If we don't plant, there's no food. Second question is, and whatever grows wildly, we're not going to harvest. We have to share it with everybody else, right? We're not going to be able to keep it to keep whatever grows for ourselves. They're asking two different questions. Number one, we're not going to plant and therefore little is going to grow. And number two, we're going to have to share with everybody else. The second question is that of the Radomsker Hasidim, right? Sure, everybody else is going to be fine, but what about me? And Shemitah is meant to teach us a very important political lesson, which is you can't just worry about yourself. You have to worry about how everybody else is doing. If when you go to the ballot box, your vote is based only on what you need and not what everybody else needs, then you're missing the point. Shemitah says, not only don't plant, but don't harvest. Don't take it for yourself. The good of the nation requires that everybody benefits. That's the message of the second part of Shemitah, and the message that the Radomsker was trying to get across to his Hasidim, and I think it's seen in the Sefer HaChinuch when he talks about developing generosity in Shemitah, right? This is what it means to be part of a state. It requires that you look after the needs of others. So Jeffrey asks the question, but this is just a narrow agricultural mitzvah. It's not. It's about how to have a state. Don't look out for your needs. Look out for everybody's needs. And then finally, the fourth area is the area of trust in Hashem. It's more than just becoming more spiritual because you're not spending your time digging in the dirt. It's a reminder of Hashem's creation of the world, a la the Gemara in Sanhedrin in Source Yud Aleph. It compels us, of course, to rely on Hashem for support. And it's a test of emunah. With the kings in Malachim, Hashem spent a lot of time trying to teach them just to rely on him. When there's an attack, when there's an assault by an enemy, the Yehoshaphat gets attacked, Asa gets attacked, Achaz is afraid of being attacked, Chizkiyahu is under attack. Hashem keeps saying via his Nevi'im, don't go out to war, leave it to me and I'll take care of it. That's what Shemitah is trying to do. It's trying to teach us that kind of trust. Now, isn't there such a thing as hishtadlus? Aren't you supposed to do things? Yes, you are. This is not an easy balance. Both aspects are critical. But that's, I think, one of the things that Shemitah is about. It's these four different elements. The element of improving our midos, our character. The element of benefiting the world, whether practically improving the land or mystically the universe. Building a nation in which everyone is responsible for each other and looks out for each other's benefit, even at their own expense, and improving our trust relationship with Hashem. There's obviously a lot more to say about this. This was an hour-long shiur. That's, again, you can get on YU Torah. But I wanted to at least start our discussion by noting these benefits of Shemitah. Comments on that before we launch into halacha? Oh, we good? Okay. So then let's go right there here. Let's get moving and see what we can do with this. So the first question is, when is Shemitah? What conditions create Shemitah? So we have a basic machlokes, a basic debate as to whether Shemitah is linked to the Yovel year. If it's linked to the Yovel year, it only applies when kol yoshveha aleha, when literally it sounds like all the residents of the land live there. If you take a look in Source Yud Gimel, from the Yerushalmi in the 10th parak, I'm assuming nobody got there this week. But in the 10th parak, you get this classic line in the Yerushalmi regarding when Shemitah applies. Taman Amrin, they said over there, and you're in the Yerushalmi, so of course, where is over there? Babel. Over there in Babel. Taman Amrin, afilu kamanda amar maisros dvar Torah, moda b'shmita shehimi divrayim. Even within the view that meiser is biblical, Shemitah is rabbinic. What do you mean? Tatani as follows: V'zed dvar Shemitah shamot. This is the word of the Shemitah. You shall be Shomet. Rabbi Omer Shnei Shemitah and Halalu. Shemitah v'Yovel. He says the double language of Shemitah and Shamot indicates that we're not talking about just Shemitah, but Shemitah and Yovel. The two go together. B'shasha Yovel Noeg, Shemitah Noeg Dvar Torah. When you have a Yovel, Shemitah applies biblically. Pasku Yovelos, Shemitah Noheges Midivrei. And Yovel stops. Shemitah is only rabbinic. And Amosai Pasku Yovelos, when does Yovel stop? The Torah says, Yosheveha, L'chol Yosheveha, the Torah says regarding Yovel, that it should be a Yovel for all of her inhabitants. Bisman Yosheveha Aleha, when Israel's residents are on her land. Lo bisman shegalo mitocha, not when they are exiled. And then another key point, which Soloveitchik emphasized, Hayu Aleha aval hayu me'urbavin, if all of Israel's residents, meaning us, are on her land, but we're all mixed up. Shevet Yehuda b'Binyamin, Shevet Binyamin b'Yehuda. All of us are living in the wrong areas. Yochel Yehuah Yovlos Nogan. I might think Yovel would apply. Talmud Lomar Yoshveha lechol Yoshveha. No, because it's kol Yoshveha. Nimtzeis Omer Kevan Shegalu Shevet Reuven v'Gad v'Chatzi Shevet HaManashe Batlu Yovlos. Once the first exile took place, which was of Reuven, Gad, and the part of Menashe that was east of the Yarden, once they were gone, at that point, Yovel ceased to function biblically, and therefore Shemitah and Yovel become rabbinic. Not only do you need what everybody talks about in the news, the majority of world Jewry living in Israel, but you also need them to be in the proper halakim, in the proper parts. We'll have more discussion about that, as well as evidence in the Bavli, when we get to this as a specific point in Shir. But right now, I'm just mentioning that issue. That is one school of thought. It happens to be the view that we tend to take halachically. However, you should know, not everybody agrees. There's a sifra in Bahar. If you take a look at source Yadalid, Minayin asay shvius afal pi she'ein Yovel. How do you know there's Shemitah even if there is no Yovel? Talmud Lomar vayu locha sheva shabsos shanim, because the Torah says you will have 7 periods of Shabbatot of years. So you're going to have this for you even without Yovel. Minayin asay Yovel af pi she'ein shvius. How do you know there's Yovel even if there's no Shemitah? Because it's counted separately. Teshav Rabbi Shana, Div Rabbi Yehuda. That's Rabbi Yehuda's position. The Chachamim disagree regarding Yovel. They say you can't have Yovel if you're not counting Shemitah. But they agree that you can have Shemitah even if you don't have Yovel. That's the position of both the Tanakama and the Rabbanan in this Sifra. You also have it implied in a Gemara in Erchan Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, as well as Rashi in Gin Lamed Vav Amud Aleph notes it's a basic machlokas Tanoim, so that it's not so clear cut. We all accept that Shemitah is D'Rabbanan in our day, but you should know not everybody is on the same page. That's a key point. There's also a question about how you calculate the date of Shemitah in general. We know that it begins ki savo al haaretz, when you enter the land. Interestingly, when you enter the land does not refer to entering Aver HaYarden. It refers to when you cross the Yarden. See this week's Toronto Torah for a little bit more about that. But the question is, when exactly is a Shemitah year? And the problem with when a Shemitah year is based in this Rambam that I brought you in source Tes Vav. The question fundamentally is this. I'll say it outside of the Rambam to explain. I might have thought the way you figure out Shemitah is every 7 years is a Shemitah year. And in fact, that's what we do. And we're actually in luck because the count that we use for Shemitah matches the count that we use for Brias HaOlam. So in other words, this coming year is 5781. You want to know where you are in the Shemitah cycle? Just divide that by 7, and that will tell you where you are in the Shemitah cycle, or whatever the remainder is. So we can do some math really quickly. We'll do some long division. The 5781, 18, 4, 41. That means you're in year 6 of your Shemitah cycle. 5782 is going to be the Shemitah year. I knew that anyway. That's why we're doing Shvius, that we can learn it in advance of the Shemitah year. But now we've actually done the math. So that's all well and good. The problem with that is the Yovel year, right? The Torah describes Yovel being year 50. So tell me something. Is that also year 1 of Shemitah? If it's year one of Shemitah, which is the way, which is the way you think to play the game, what ends up happening to your Shemitah year after one cycle? It shifts, right? I'm trying to mix my attention between the Chaverim here and the people on Zoom. Hopefully that's working. But think about it. How does this actually work? Because if year 50 is also year one, then your next time you get to a Yovel year, Yovel will not be in sequence with Shemitah anymore. There'll be a year between them. And each cycle of 50 years, you'll be one more year off. You will eventually have a case in which Yovel year will be during Shemitah. So the other way to do it is to say that Yovel is year zero. Sorry? The other way to do it is to say Yovel is year zero. It's a null year in the cycle. But if you do that, then that means you can't just say Shemitah is every 7 years. You have to know when Yovel was. Take a look at source test Vav on your sheet. Shnas Yovel Eina Ola Miminyan Shnei Shavua. The Rambam says it's a null year. Ela Shnas Teishav Arbaim Shemitah. Shnas Chamishim Yovel, Shnas Chamishim V'achas, Tchilas Sheish Shanim Shel Shavua. He says the way it works is Shemitah count is paused during Yovel, and it starts again after that. And of course, there are other views. There are those who look at the Rambam and say, what are you talking about? That's not what the Gemara said. And more complicated by the question of, well, when does Yovel apply at all? And if Yovel is not enforced, then what happens to our count? What the Rambam believes is that when Yovel is not functioning, it isn't a year zero. So right now, I'm not worried about when Yovel is. There is no such thing as a Yovel year. You need to restart Yovel in order for this to become a headache. But this is a fascinating problem, this issue. Okay. Sorry?
Was there ever a celebrated Yovel year? Because the Jews avoided all Shemitah years during all of entering Israel through Beit Rishon and the Beit Sheni. They didn't observe the Yovel once. So does that mean that we've never had a Yovel year ever?
So that will depend on our question that we had, the Machlokes Tana, about whether Yovel is dependent on Shemitah. But there is such a discussion. And there's also a whole machlokes about how to count Shemitah when there's no Yovel year. Like I took it as Glat, what the Rambam does. But the truth is, if you look at the Ravid and look at Rav Chaim al Rambam, it's not so clear cut in that sense either. But going back to your question, this is a whole discussion also in the Tosfos regarding Prosbol. It's a bigger issue, right? Tosfos versus the Ramban on Prosbol and is Shemitah the Rabbanon. And are we observing Yovel? Were they observing Yovel in the time of Hillel? Like, it's a gargantuan problem. Okay, so like I said, this is an overview, raising problems that we need to revisit. So let's get into what people usually think of, which is what Jeffrey talked about before. Isn't this all supposed to be an agricultural thing? Why are you messing around with the calendar? So the first aspect we're going to talk about is working the land. So I brought you the psukim from Parshas Bahar in source Tez Zayin, where we are told, when you enter the land that I am giving you, ha'aretz asher ani nosein lachem, v'shav sahar shabas lashem, the land shall halt. Sheish shanim tizras sadecha v'sheish shanim tizmor karmecha v'asavtos v'asaf. For 6 years you are planting. For 6 years you are pruning, and you will gather the produce. Whether that's an active mitzvah of working the land for those 6 years is actually a really interesting question. The same way we asked regarding Shabbos. Is there a mitzvah of sheishes yamim, 6 days you shall do malacha? Ubashana shvi'is Shabbat Shabbaton yela eretz. The 7th year, a halting for the land for the year. Shabbos la'Hashem. Sarchalos is ra, v'chamachalos is more. Do not plant, do not prune your vineyard. Esviach kitzircha lo siktzor, do not harvest the wild stuff. V'as inevein izirach lo siktzor, don't harvest the grapes that grow. Shnas Shabbaton yela aretz, it's a year of halting for the land, and it'll be for you and for everybody to eat. We'll have to come back to that. So out of this, we gain 3 mitzvos. Number 1, in source Yud Zayin, you see the list, the Mitzvah of Shabbaton. And I thank again the Chavrusa of Rabbi Metzger and Rabbi Bergman for noting that I had omitted this in my original list that I sent out. Shkayach. The Mitzvah of Shabbaton, which I gave you the references there for, you can find it in the Rambam Sefer HaMitzvos, in the Smag, as well as in the Sefer HaChinuch. Create Shabbaton from working the land. Okay, you're actively creating Shabbaton. If you think of this regarding Yom Tov, we have a mitzvah of Shabbaton. And Shabbos, we have a mitzvah of Shabbat, well, not Yom Tov necessarily, but Shabbos, we have a mitzvah of Shabbaton, create an atmosphere of Shabbos. So this is a mitzvah saseh, create an atmosphere of halting, separate from the other two mitzvos, the lo sases, don't work the land and don't work the trees. So one of the major questions we have to address is the question of which land in Israel is exactly subject to Shemitah. Where is Eretz Yisrael? So the Mishnah in Shvius, in Source Yirches, it's in the beginning of Parak Vav, tells us, Shalosh Aratzos l'Shvius. We have three different areas. One, Kol shechziku ole Bavel me'eretz Yisrael v'agziv lo ne'achav lo ne'avad. Land which ole Bavel took, which the Jews took when they came back from Bavel for the second Beis HaMikdash. That land is one area, and in that land you're not allowed to eat. And what it means when it says you're not allowed to eat is talking about Zichron, that which grows wild. We'll see there's a rabbinic decree against eating that which grows wild during Shemitah. So that's what is discussing here and saying you're not allowed to eat that from that land. That's where full Shemitah takes place. Land that the Jews took when they came back from Bavel. I should note, Rafrati in Gvulot Haaretz LaShvi'it, which is actually available on Bar Ilan in the Kitvei 8. So he notes that the Kesef Mishnah who says it doesn't mean the conquest of or what was given to those Jews who came back from Bavel alone. Rather, what it also means is land conquered later on in the second Beis HaMikdash. Rav Yaakov Emden says the same thing as well. So in other words, if the Chashmonaim conquered some land, that also has Shemitah De'oraisa. That's one area. The second area is land that was taken by the Jews when they came out of Mitzrayim, out of Egypt, but it was not taken when they came back for the second Beis HaMikdash. And in that land, you're allowed to eat the Zichron. That Gezer D'Rabbanan does not apply, but you're not allowed to work the land during Shemitah. And there's a machlokes as to whether the produce that grows there has Kedushas Shvius. And then you have a third area. And for this, I refer you to source Yud Tes, a Gemara in Chagiga. Amon u'Moav ma'asrin meiser ani b'shvius. You take meiser ani in Ammon and Moav during Shemitah, meaning meiser ani is only in the 3rd and 6th years of the Shemitah cycle. However, if you are fortunate enough to live east of the Yarden and a little south in Ammon and Moav, then you separate meiser ani in Shemitah. Matam, why? Harbe krachim kavshu ole Mitzrayim v'lo kavshum ole Bavel. Because there were many cities that the Jews did not take for the second Beis HaMikdash, which had been taken when they entered the land initially. The original Kedusha did not persist there. And they deliberately said, we are not taking these cities when we come back for the second Beis HaMikdash, because we want the poor to be able to eat in this land. They'll be able to work the land and they'll be able to get the produce. So therefore we're leaving it for their use during Shemitah. This is a third area. I have one area which is land we got initially and took again, came back for the second Beis HaMikdash, full Shemitah. Second, I have land that they did not take when they came back for the, which they did not take when they came back. However, it has the rule of not working the land. And then you have a third area, which we have to talk more about in Shir, obviously, in which there apparently is no Shemitah whatsoever because they left it intentionally for them. Why is that land any different from the second category is something that we're going to need to talk about. I'm not claiming to have resolved that. I'm just raising this point that we actually have cities that are left out of Shemitah intentionally. Okay, whatever that meant. But what are the boundaries of this land? So where is this land that Shemitah does apply in? So I brought you two articles of mine because we're not dealing with this in depth now, but I want to come back to it in Shir. But these are summary articles that I put in Toronto Torah. The first one in source Chaf is the southern boundary of Eretz Yisrael. Wow, is that a complicated issue? I mean, when you look at the boundaries of Israel, the western boundary is fairly straightforward. We call it the Mediterranean, right? We have some discussion about islands in the Mediterranean, but basically it's the Mediterranean. The southern boundary is incredibly confusing because we have different ways to calculate it. And that's what I brought you in source Chaf. So you can see a little bit of a discussion in source Chaf about how we do this calculation. But it's really a fascinating discussion. And then in source Chaf Aleph, we have the question of Transjordan to the east. What is the status of Aver Hayardin? That's in this week's Toronto Torah, but it's also here on your sheet in Source Chaf Aleph. So we need to deal with all of these questions in Shir, as well as the question of Egypt. Is any part of Egypt in? What about Syria? Is any part of Syria in? So I'm hopeful that we're going to get to have a conversation about all of this and why we have different shitos on this. Okay, is that unclear? Good? Okay. Beyond these questions of boundaries, we also have to ask the question of, what about land that is owned by someone who isn't Jewish? What if someone who isn't Jewish owns land in Israel? I know it's hard to imagine, but it might happen. So will Shemitah apply to that person's land? Or do we say, Yesh Kinyan, that he is able to acquire the land to remove its Shemitah status? This is a key Gemara in Gittin, which I brought you in Source Chaf Beis. The Mishnah there says, if you sell your field to a non-Jew, you have a responsibility to buy the first fruits from him and bring him to the Beis HaMikdash. It's a rabbinic decree. It's a rabbinic enactment for the sake of the world. What that means for the sake of the world is not our discussion right now. But look at what the Gemara does with that. Amar Rabba. He says, even though if a non-Jew owns land in Israel, you're still obligated in Meiser for produce from that land. If I buy produce from him, I have to separate Truma and Meiser. Hashem says, I don't care who's holding the deed. The land is mine. He says, nonetheless, the non-Jew is allowed to damage the land. He's allowed to dig cisterns in the land if he wishes, because Hashem gave human beings the land. He can do what he wants to the land itself. That's Rabba's position. And then you get Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar Omer. He says, even though the Obe Kochavim does have the ability to remove Meiser, in other words, there is no Meiser separation on produce that the non-Jew grows in Israel, because the Torah says the Gancha is obligated in it. This is not the Gancha. It's not your Dagan. It's not your grain. It's the Akum's grain. But he's not allowed to mess with the land itself. You can't let him dig cisterns. Because the pasuk says, Lashem ha'aretz umloa, right? The classic conflict, Lashem ha'aretz umloa and ha'aretz nasan l'bnei adam. Fine. What's the machlokes about? I'm not going into that discussion right now. The point that I wanted to bring out of this is the question of whether Maestros will apply on his land, because it's the same question regarding whether Shemitah will apply on his land. So the question is, who do we follow in this machlokes? Does the Akum have control of the land such that Meiser, Truma, Shemitah will not apply? Do we follow Rabbah or not? So the Rambam's position is unclear in this regard, because in Source Chav Gimel, you see the Rambam say, Akum shekana karka beretz Yisrael lo hivkiyuam et mitzvos ela rehi b'kedushasa. If a non-Jew acquires land in Israel, it retains its kedusha. So therefore, does Shemitah apply or not? Yes, Shemitah applies. The kedusha is still there, right? That seems to be straightforward. However, if you take a look in Source Chav Daled, the Rambam writes, Akum shekana karka be'eretz Yisrael v'zar b'shviyas peraseh mutarin. He says, if a non-Jew owns land in Israel and then plants in it, the produce is going to be permitted. Whatever grows there is going to be fine. The gezerah of Svichen is not going to apply in the land for reasons that we will come back to. So he says, the land's produce is not subject to the laws of Shemitah. But you just told me, you told me Kedusha is retained. So I don't understand. The Rambam's position is unclear and will require some discussion. But that's a major, major question. Not only that, there's an additional question that goes along with it. Even if you believe that an Akum's land is not subject to basic Shemitah, that does not mean that all malacha is permitted by a Jew in that land. And that becomes an issue regarding what's called the heter mechira, right? We have the practice of selling off control of the land to a non-Jew for a period of time and saying that that will permit certain things. So number one, it doesn't necessarily permit all malachos. But number two, there are all sorts of questions we have to have about that, such as, does Karen Kayemet Israel actually have the authority to sell the land of an individual farmer in Israel? Who actually owns Israel anyway? Don't all of us own 4 amos in eretz Yisrael? How do you have the right to sell that on my behalf? Maybe selling the land violates lo sechanim. You're not supposed to give the akum chanoya bekarka. Maybe you're not supposed to do that. And if it does, then maybe the sale is invalid because the person selling it is acting as my shaliach and ein shliach lidvar avera. He can't be my shaliach to do something that's illegal. Maybe the whole sale is considered a joke. Maybe it's a ha'arama. It's a trick. You plan to buy it back. All sorts of questions regarding this. Yes, Rosemi is laughing. Go ahead. I'm not ripping it. I'm just pointing out the questions that we have to address when we give shear on it. I'm certainly not ripping. Who am I to rip the heter mechira? I will note one key point for people to be aware of. People always talk about Rav Kook as the major proponent of the heter mechira. You should understand, and we'll see it in the course of the year, God willing. What permits Rav Kook to be making with the heter mechira is the fact that he's machmir on basically everything regarding Shemitah. He's extremely severe on various aspects of the Shemitah year. So be careful what you wish for in terms of heter mechira. But we'll see that. Okay, this is all about the land, right? We talked a little bit about dimensions of the land. We talked a little bit about land owned by a non-Jew. But now let's talk about the other piece of working the land. What exactly does working mean? So the Rambam gives us in source Chaf Hey, a basic digest. Those who are doing the Yerushalmi may have seen this already. The Rambam talks about malachos that are involved in protecting the trees in Israel, and he says, why are those permitted? And he says the answer is because, and we'll talk about those tree acts in a moment, but he says, why is it that we permit taking care of trees in Israel? Because after all, the whole thing with trees is a derabanan. The whole business about maintaining your trees, about watering them at any rate, is rabbinic. What do you mean? Look at the second line in Chavhei. She'ein aser min haTorah la'osan shnei avos u'shtei toldos shalahem kamo shebiyarnu. He says the only biblical prohibitions during Shemitah in terms of working the land are the 2 avos, which are zriya and ketzira, planting and harvesting, and the 2 toldos, which are zemira and bitzira, pruning and harvesting grapes. Those are your only deoraisas in Shemitah. Now, even as the Rambam says this, you should know he doesn't really mean it, because there is a 5th malacha deoraisa, and that is plowing. You already saw that hopefully in the beginning of the Yerushalmi, and I brought you a piece of it here in source Chavav, in which we deduce from the pasuk of Sheishanim tizra sadecha, Sheishanim tizmor karmecha. Somehow we deduce from that that you're not allowed to plow. How exactly? Look at we're gonna have to discuss it more. Look at the Yerushalmi. More of the point. Look at the Gemara Moed Katan Gimel Amid Beis and the whole discussion about Charisha Bakatzir Tishbos. But fundamentally, we understand that plowing is likely a deoraisa as well. What about actions that maintain trees? So the Rambam just told you actions to maintain trees are okay in order to prevent pseida, to prevent loss. And that's a Gemara in the beginning of Moed Katan. I brought it in source Chav Zayin. It's Ashrei Mishnah. Mashkin Beis Hashlachan B'Moed U'B'Shvi. As there they talk about watering land that only gets water by irrigation. And they have a discussion there about Moed, about doing so on Chol HaMoed, as well as doing it in Shemitah. And they say that you're allowed to water land that needs irrigation in Shemitah. And Rashi there comments that it's actually prohibited rabbinically during Shemitah to water a field. However, as we saw in the Rambam, there would be pseida, there would be loss without it. The Chazon Ish here says something fascinating that I think is worth sitting up and taking notice. The Chazon Ish says, this doesn't mean that pseida, loss, removes the rabbinic prohibition. It means the Chachamim didn't create the derabanan in the first place for these activities. You follow? It's not that the Peseda permits it. It's that the Rabbanan didn't prohibit it in the first place. If you look at the wording in the Rambam in Source Chavei, Lo Gazru Al Elu. They didn't create a rabbinic decree. Why does this matter? Because what if it doesn't involve Peseda? What if I just want to water it without Peseda? If my heter was to prevent loss, they wouldn't be allowed. But he's saying there is no such derabanan at all. There's a whole other discussion about what about working on trees in ways to preserve the fruit, which Rav Kook does not allow and the Chazon Ish does allow. But that's a whole other discussion, which we'll have to get to in Shir. So working the land biblically means planting, it means harvesting the grapes, it means pruning, it means plowing. It does not mean watering the trees, that's for sure. We do have other actions, though, that are prohibited midirabanan. What about working the land if the land is not attached to the land? Meaning, what if I have earth that is actually in a greenhouse? Right? Inside my house, I have earth and I'm growing things in there. What about that? Is that okay? So there's a significant basis for leniency in the Yerushalmi and Arla. If you take a look at source Chaf Ches, Rabbi Yochanan b'Shem Rabbi Yanai, Elon shenato b'soch habayis chayav ba'arla. He says, if you plant a tree in your house, you're still not allowed to use the fruit for the first 3 years. That doesn't get you out of the law of Arla. Upater min ha'maisros, but you're exempt from meiser, and he gives you a pasuk which says hayotzei hasadeh, only that which is in the sadeh is chayav in truma and meiser, and ubashvius, as well as regarding Shmitah, you are exempt because the pasuk says v'shavsa ha'aretz. It's not called eretz. If you take land out of the field and you move it into a house, it's not subject to Shmitah. And also sarcholos is rach, hamacholos is more. We actually get 2 psukim for the price of one. The Pas HaShulchan says, therefore, we are lenient today. I'm sorry, take that back. The Gemara has a further discussion about this and does not actually have a conclusion regarding Shemitah. I shouldn't have painted it as black and white. It's not. However, the Pas HaShulchan says, since Shemitah today is a derabanan, which we do assume, therefore we can be lenient. That's the idea. The Chazon Ish has some doubts because there are biblical aspects to Shemitah, even Bismanenu, but that's one basis for Kula. The other basis for a Kula is that aside from being in a house, it's actually separate from the ground. In other words, imagine the case in which it's not in a house. I have a field outside. I take some earth, I put it up on a platform separate from the ground. It's still under the sky. What will be the law there? And I have basis for leniency for that as well, based on Yerushalmi in Demai, in source Chav Tes. They talk about the law of an atzitz. An atzitz is a pot. There is an atzitz nakuv, a pot with a hole in it, and there is an atzitz she'eno nakuv, a pot without a hole in it. So the atzitz she'eno nakuv, a pot without a hole in it in the Yerushalmi and Demai, is considered a suffix. It's considered to be subject to doubt. So the Radbaz writes in Hilchos Shmitah v'Yoloville Parak Aleph Halacha Vav that it's asur midirabanan. Chazon Ish though says the Gemara doesn't seem to think that it's asur. And so the Chazon Ish offered a heter for greenhouses. And that's what I brought you here in source Lamed, commenting on that Yerushalmi in Demai. He says, I don't think that's really such a thing. Don't worry about the word misafek at the end of that Yerushalmi. And he says, on that basis, you could be makil, you could be lenient regarding an unpierced pot beneath the roof of a house, which is also known as a greenhouse. And he says one who is makil is able to rely on it. The truth of the matter is that in another place in the Chazon Ish, he's a little less enthusiastic, but he still allows it. And Rabbi Yamin Zilber in his Bris Olam allows it where it's chaye nefesh. He doesn't like it for growing things for decorative purposes, but for chaye nefesh, he's willing to allow it. So we're going to need to spend a lot of time defining what indoors means and what separate from the ground means, but that's another of the questions that we need to address. One more issue in terms of working the land is the issue of working the land before Shemitah, which you've been discussing in the Yerushalmi this week. What about working the land in the month before Shavuos? So the Tosas Yom Tov makes the assumption, which I brought you in source Lamed Beis, that it's a derabanan, not to work the land before Shemitah, but most actually assume that it's a deoraisa, ala the Chazon Ish in Yud Zayin Aleph, which I actually thought I brought on here, but I don't have it here, but it's in Shvius Yud Zayin Aleph. He believes that it's actually a deoraisa. This goes back to what you discussed, I think, in Chabura yesterday, the Bavli versus the Yerushalmi and Rabbi Lazar's read of Rav Dimi and all of that. But that's a din in its own right that requires its own investigation. So all of this is under the rubric of working the land. What about the issue of abandoning wild produce? Now, Zoom or the Clanton Park Internet stole like 5 minutes from me, but I'm going to do what I can to at least discuss the issue of abandoning the wild produce as well. In Parshas Mishpatim, we are taught, Vashvias tishmitana unitashta, during Shemitah, abandon it, leave it be, v'achlu avionei amecha, let the paupers eat it, v'yisram tochal chayas hasadeh, and then the animals can eat whatever's left over. I should note, it's not about leaving it for the needy, even though we do talk about chesed and staka in Shemitah, you know that everybody gets to come in. Your wealthy neighbor down the block is also able to come in and take from your field. Nonetheless, the mitzvah is don't harvest it, just abandon it. And the Rambam I brought you here in source Lamed Daled, Sefer HaMitzvahs to say Kuf Lamed Daled, the Smag Kuf Mem Ches, the Chinuch Pei Daled, say that it's a mitzvah of abandoning the produce. What does that exactly look like? So there is a mitzvah of declaring everything hefker. The Rambam in Hilchah Shmitah v'Yoloville in source Lamed Hey says, Mitzvahs aseh lahashmit kol ma shetotzi aretz b'shvius. You have to be mashmit it. You have to be shomed it. You have to abandon it. And what that means seems to be that you actually have to be mashmit it. You have to declare it hefker as well as don't fence it in. He says, if you fence in your vineyard, if you fence in your field, you are mevatel a mitzvah saseh. Ditto if you bring all of your produce into your home. Now, the truth is, it may be considered hefker even if you don't. Actually, I'm sorry, I stopped short because it was on the next page. Keep on reading in that Rambam. Ela yafkir hakol. You have to actually make it hefker, v'yada kol shavin bo, and everybody is able to get. So you declare it hefker. Sorry. It may be hefker even if you don't declare it so. The Rav Chaim Kanievsky has a comment on that in the Derech Emunah, which I didn't bring you here on the sheet, but we will need to discuss. There's also a machlokes. What about produce that a non-Jew grows? Is that also hefker? It's a machlokes rishonim. The Ravid says it's not hefker. The Rash says it's not hefker. The Mabit and the Ma'arit say it is. What about this business about fencing it in or not fencing it in? So from the Rambam, I would have assumed that it means don't build fences on your land. Take a look at this Mechilta in source Lamed Vav on Vashvias Tishmitanu Tashta. Mibnei ma amra Torah lo sheyochlu osa aniyim, harei ani machniso machalkal aniyim. He says, you might say to yourself, doesn't the Torah just want the needy people to get the produce? So I'm going to go one better. Instead of just leaving it open, I will actually collect it and I'll put it out on a day, or I'll deliver it to their houses. He says the mitzvah actually isn't go give it to the needy. The mitzvah is Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall for those of a certain age. That's what you're supposed to do. You have to demolish the wall. And then anybody who wants to come in can come in. He says, the Chum said, we're not going to go that far. We're not going to force you to actually tear down the fences. We'll have to talk about what it means exactly and what the limits are. But it's clear you're not allowed to fence it in, which leads to a machlokes. What is the status of produce that you did fence in? And what if you find other ways to guard your produce? What if you put guard dogs at the boundary of your property? Does that count as violating this from the Rambam? Now, the next point on this, I'm going to take one moment just to finish off with this, is the Gzera of Zichron, which we've mentioned already, which says that I'm not allowed to eat produce that grows wildly in Israel. In the Rambam that I brought you here in Source Lamed Zayin, we clarify what that means is if it grows wildly in a field that is normally cultivated, it's prohibited rabbinically. And the reason why is because we're afraid that people are going to plant clandestinely and claim, well, it grew wildly. What do you know? I got a bounty during Shemitah. God likes me. So therefore, we said if it grows in a field that is normally cultivated, it is off limits. And there's what we call Zichron, nispach, sapachas, that which was appended on. This produce is off limits. How long is it off limits? So the Rambam says it's prohibited until Hanukkah of the following year. After Hanukkah, you can eat it, says the Rambam in source Lamed Ches. The Rabbi says, I don't know where in the world he got Hanukkah from. The Rabbi thinks this is just wrong, but that's the position of the Rambam. So clearly, we did not get through everything that we wanted to talk about here, to say the least. We also haven't discussed. All right, two last notes within it. Number one, land of a non-Jew. The Rambam writes, Zichron will not apply to his land. That was what we saw earlier because he's allowed to plant. There's no gezerah lest the non-Jew plant. And then there's a debate, what about flowers? Because, not about eating them, but about using them. Because flowers might not have Kedusha Shvius, which we have to come back to later. So some suggest that the rules of Zichron do not apply to flowers. On the other hand, Rabbi Yamin Zilber points out that the Rambam didn't specify fruit. So therefore it should apply to flowers. It's anything that grows when you work the land. That's a machlokes. So what we still have not covered is altered harvesting and Kedusha Shvius. So what I plan to do is to record that and send you a link so that you'll have that as well. I hope that this wasn't too fast to be useful. What I'm trying to do, as I said in the beginning, is just to lay out the ground so that you can see what the issues are in a structured way. You're not just walking blind into a Masechta. I hope that that provides some utility to you. Thank you very much. I wish you a good Shabbos and Bli Neder later today or Motzei Shabbos or something. I will send out the link for the follow-up part of this. Rav Sammy gives shir next week, and you're giving shir on.
I want to talk about how the theme that you shouldn't treat the Piros as yours really relates to all different mitzvahs, not just separate, but one big theme.
Right. Okay. So Rav Sammy will have his theme within it, and then the rest of this man in general is going to be topics, big picture topics, and then we'll move into stuff that's more based in the Yerushalmi. Thank you very much, especially to the Chaverim who showed up in person and those who are joining us in our learning this year. And I wish everybody a good Shabbos.